Okay. Good morning. So this panel is starting the way a lot of panels at 8:30 in the morning start after a fun night at a conference. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you this morning to another one in our invited series of sessions under the rubric of Unsettling Records, Reworking Anthropology's Role in Troubling Times. The subtitle for this session is Bodies. And before I begin, I would like to welcome you all with much gratitude, humility, and respect to the traditional territories of the coastal Salish and Strait Salish people. And I'd like to say that this panel, in part, is made possible through the funding of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. They don't fund medical anthropology anymore, but we find ways to sneak it in. Yeah. You just do a search and replace for the word health and call it well-being. It's pretty much what I did. All right, so without any more delay, it's my very great pleasure to introduce the first panelist. Our presentations are in the order of about 15 minutes, and I am going to be sitting there in the front with my timekeeping. So the first panelist today is Daniela Heil from the University of Newcastle, Australia, not the UK, Australia. And the title of her paper is Body Politics and Their Medicalization in Aboriginal Australia. Mobile Bodies Keep the Ngyiampaa Healthy? Question mark.
Thank you. There we go. Very much, Lisa. Okay. Is that working? Yeah. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad there's some of you here, which is fabulous, this early morning on a Friday. Okay, I'll start straight away with my paper. This paper aims to refer to the multiple perspectives and understandings in which bodies-related politics and their medicalisation have been addressed and worked with by Aboriginal patients and their healthcare providers in Australia. Or to formulate this differently, who in a given political context has the power to define what constitutes healing, maintained by Langwick as, quote, the ontological politics of therapeutic objects. According to Fassin, inequalities are felt more strongly perhaps than ever before. Whilst the disparities between Australian Aboriginal and non-Indigenous health continue to be primarily addressed in quantitative rather than qualitative terms, health policy, healthcare practices, media, etc., it is the drawing attention to morbidity and mortality rates that has contributed to continuously reinforcing an Indigenous versus non-Indigenous homogeneity as well. Hence, resulting outcomes in that regard have often been negative connotations for Indigenous Australians in terms of not fitting, and their ongoing marginalisation rather than constructive feedback for Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians alike. Thus, the analysis presented here aims to contribute to overcoming the distinct boundaries that exist between different types of healing practices by illustrating how Aboriginal Ngyiampaa health concerns and practices, as experienced in the all-Aboriginal community of Murrin Bridge in central western New South Wales, Australia, have both drawn on and responded to biomedically informed advice and practices. Whilst biomedical bits and pieces have become used and incorporated in Murrin Bridge people's life and practices since the establishment of the community in 1949, those have not simply been taken on board and reproduced, nor have they been adopted and prioritised as intended. Murrin Bridge is an all-Aboriginal Ngyiampaa community on the Lachlan River in central western New South Wales. This is the Australian state in which different Aboriginal language groups first experienced European occupation and where they have become participants in colonial encounters since 1788 in the east and from the 1850s in the western parts of the state. Founded as an Aboriginal station in 1949, the government resettled the residents from a reserve at Menindee over 300 kilometres to the west in Paganji country. Previous to Menindee, from 1924 to 1933, the majority of those Aboriginal people had lived in a government settlement at Karora Tang, which lies in the heart of Wangaipuan country. However, those people's language is called Ngyiampaa, and Ngyiampaa is also the language the majority of Murrumbidgee residents are traditionally related to today. Murrumbidgee comprises 3 to 3 parallel streets, currently with 37 houses and 5 flats. Depending on the time of the year and the events that occur within the communal setting, it usually accommodates a population of 185 to 215 people, and sometimes up to 850 people at a time, funerals, weddings, celebrations like community celebrations addressing the history. The community has had its communal health centre, locally known as the Clinic, since sometime in the 1980s. Prior to the 1967 Australian referendum that officially acknowledged Aboriginal people as Australian citizens, I mean, we can discuss what officially means in depth here. I'm not going there because it takes up too much time. The mission manager would take local Aboriginal people into town, a 15-kilometre drive away, when they required a doctor or nurse. According to one Murrumbidgee resident, then from the late 60s to the early 80s, we had to find our own way into town when we needed medical help. What he means in that particular moment is that they were never asked where they wanted to live, and that they had to get used to accommodating and mediating the decisions that non-Indigenous Australians had previously made on their behalf. With the development of an intrusive pastoral industry since the late 19th century within the Greater New South Wales region, Aboriginal people quickly became engaged. Simultaneously, extensive adjustments on their part were required as well. Many common and familiar everyday practices, such as hunting and gathering, the performance of rituals and spiritual belief systems, could not be sustained in the same way due to the changes and modifications originating from the ongoing colonial incursions, leading not only to a sedentary lifestyle, but socioeconomic marginalisation and high rates of welfare dependency that have persisted to the present day. The shaping of Murrumbidgee residents' everyday life and practice derives largely from the demands of kin-relatedness and what local Aboriginal people refer to as enjoyment and work. All of those practices put particular emphasis on people's interactive engagements with others, as well as their personal obligations to others, rather than a sense of themselves as individuals, ideologically defined as autonomous, self-animated, and self-enclosed agents. Enjoyment activities include playing cards, buying cigarettes, and cartons of beer to share with one's mob. Someone might fill the car with petrol to visit relatives in town or play the poker machine at one of the local pubs. Over the last 30 years, it has become a common practice for younger and older generations to buy and become selfishly dependent on illicit drugs. The dependency on drugs has introduced neglecting kin-related others. As many older Murrumbidgee residents say these days, instead of caring for others as they used to, now many look only after themselves. Me is all they worry about. It's not right. When referring to work, Murrumbidgee people mean either attending the Lake Angelica Vocational Training College for educational courses of their choice, or working on the Community Development Employment Project known as CDP, and the project most Murrumbidgee residents continue to participate in. CDP is a program that links welfare payments with work-related training to do something for one's own personal communal living space and social environment. Okay, leaving out a paragraph here. Let me refer to two Ngyiampaa people in each of their encounters with medical personnel at the clinic. Rob is heavily obese, on the grog 2 to 3 times per week, has successfully completed a tertiary level degree several decades ago in Sydney, and has worked in a well-paid job comprising high-level responsibilities for many decades. He retired some years ago because of no longer being prepared to deal with mediating the professional and personal pressures as an inherent component of his daily personal and professional life. Other Murrumbidgee people commonly refer to Rob as very smart and brainy because he knows what goes on in the world. He's always able to give advice to others, and most of his relatives consider him a mentor they look up to. He's respected because he knows what's right and what's wrong. Recently, Rob went to the doctor for a prescription of his blood pressure tablets. As soon as the doctor saw him entering the consultancy room, as Rob states, I wasn't even sitting yet, he started preaching to me about not managing my sugar well enough, neglecting the body, and that it is my own fault that my kidneys are no longer working properly. Rob admits I was stunned, and the only thing I could do in that moment was burst into laughter. Can you believe the stereotyping and the generalizations these people work with? And you know who the doctor was referring you to, don't you? Rob explained to the doctor why he was there, and he added that the person he thought he was actually someone else, with the same surname but opposite sex, named Janice, and certainly not Rob. And do you think the doctor would have apologized regarding his mistake? No, he did not. He looked at me and said, well, you are on your way of getting there too. From Rob's subjective experience, the doctor's comments hurt because he did neither seem to care about Rob nor his personal needs. Instead, he appeared to be working with common understandings frequently applied to Aboriginal Australians. Being obese, lack of physical activity, and linked to that, suffering from badly managed type 2 diabetes. And as stated by Rob, he did look down on me. Janice's patient story complements Rob's insofar as it draws attention to similar issues, even though addressing them differently. She's had type 2 diabetes for approximately 20 years. She received her diagnosis in the early 90s with a simultaneous message that her kidneys were damaged. She remembers that every doctor and nurse talking with her looked worried and serious. However, she was standing and walking and still able to look after the grandchildren. To the present day, almost 20 years later, she's not quite sure what this actually means. Yes, of course, different doctors have talked with her about it many, many times at the local clinic. The hospital in town, as well as the hospital in Wagga Wagga, where she sometimes travels for the day to have special tests done every 2 to 3 months. While she goes to the doctors regularly, she tries not to worry too much. On the one hand, she's quite angry because if whitefellas hadn't introduced us to the sugar and moved us around the country, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in now. On the other hand, Janice is very open and direct about how she feels, not only about her body and related to that her health, but about the ways in which non-Indigenous people more generally, and she does include the health system here, have been treating her and her people as well. You have to keep going and look after your kin. That's what we do and who we are. And the doctors claim they want to fix and help you. Then they look at you and they say, do this and do that. They boss you around. But I'm still walking. As I've elaborated elsewhere, as long as Ngyiampaa people consider themselves to be able to work with and apply the mobility of their individual bodies, they consider themselves in the position of being healthy because they have a social presence and are able to engage with and look after others. In comparison, as soon as healthcare providers put an emphasis on the state of health of individual bodies, medicalization is brought to the fore, retaining key medical notions that situate the problem of health and disease at the level of the individual. However, whilst mainstream health practices reflect an individualized treatment mode, Australian mainstream healthcare providers work with this mode in terms of defining the Aboriginal patient as deficient, with the aim to reconstruct the individual's understanding of the problem, for which help appears to have been sought. Throughout the process of encounter between healthcare provider and Aboriginal patient, the biological and physical manifestations of the individual diseased human body is emphasized from the perspective of the healthcare provider. However, the ways in which those understandings are elaborated from the perspectives of Ngyiampaa people are not the same, but different. When Rob enters the doctor's consultancy room, he's immediately monitored, watched, and judged, and he himself perceives and feels this as well. The medical professional applies his professional obligations and duty of care by referring to what he sees in front of him as an individualized disease-related problem to be addressed. Accordingly, he enacts his professional duty of care, alerting the patient who is obese to the fact they have been neglecting their personal duty of care. From Rob, the patient's perspective, this suggests a racializing and historicized approach, being subjected to domineering strategizing and continuing marginalization by non-Indigenous Australians in the present, in continuing forms of being colonized and continuously marginalized by the latter, as I said, to the present day. Whilst Rob is sufficiently confident about himself and able to deal with those comments quite well, he nevertheless perceives them and feels hurt by them. As he says, whilst we're used to it, because it has been a common part of our lives, it does not make it right. What I'm suggesting here is that there is a synthesis that has become constructed throughout the debate that ends up in a melting and blending of different bodily forms, presentations, and perspectives, reflecting the meeting of different ontological domains that do not only draw attention to body politics, but reflect their medicalization as well. Often those result in objectified statements regarding Aboriginal Australians. Obviously, this includes the Ngyiampaa, their health and related policies and practices. In the multitudinous interchanges of social life, persons represent to themselves and others the relations that compose them. Individuated at the moment of action, they can also in effect decompose themselves. And a principal occasion on which they do so is, as I put elsewhere, by engaging their bodies in social engagements with kin-related others. Correspondingly, mobile bodies keep us healthy. However, a point that needs to be kept in mind is that there is a crucial element of human sociality that is very poorly captured by theories that emphasize material co-presence alone. This is what Moore terms the human capacity for virtuality, for endowing things of the imagination and the mind with meaning and significance as well. In response to Moore, Marilyn Strathern works with perspectives, implying an externalizing vision or perception as well. Bodies being the seeds of perspectives, it is the kind of body one has that summons what world one sees. In that regard, a rather small but obvious conclusion might be that concepts of subjectivity and objectivity, as analytically deployed, are no more than placeholders for distinctions that medical service providers and Aboriginal patients work out through protocols of being, and consequently perspectives of, on, and about bodies. An essential question to be addressed in future anthropological work is what the act of bodily perspectives and their engagements with each other over time conveys about agency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Our second presenter this morning is Pilar Rian Alcala from University of British Columbia. The title of her paper is Justice Narratives and Bodily Testimonial Practice Among the Wayuu in the Upper Guajira of Colombia.
Good morning, bonjour, buenos dias, everyone. First, thank you to Liz and Andrea for organizing this very interesting set of panels. And let's see how I do with time. And I have to remember this. Indigenous perspectives on land as a territorial marker of identity and memoryscape of daily life with my research work in my native country, Colombia. In a country that has endured over 50 years of internal armed conflict, land and territorial identity are painfully connected to experiences of forced displacement, dispossession, and loss of livelihood means. My ongoing collaboration and collaborative work with the Wayuu people of Vallaportete, an indigenous group, and around issues of historical memory and justice pretty much had brought many questions and insights to these themes about displacement. In this presentation, I want to describe to you a visit of a judicial commission, an institutional commission to Vallaportete, and explore the justice narratives and in place testimonial practices that took place during these visits. And I think it will be an opportunity to explore the type of topics that we're exploring with this panel around the record and the bodies. The critical event that frames this visit, that frames pretty much the type of positions and testimonial practices enacted by the Wayuu, is an event that took place in April 18th, 2004, when 6 members of the community, 4 of them women, were killed, several others were tortured, and the entire community of 600 members were displaced from their traditional territory. The massacre was a critical, and it's been seen by the Wayuu as the most critical event in the last 200 years, because for the first time in the Wayuu's history of the Upper Guajira, displaced people from their traditional territory. This hasn't happened. They had never been conquered by the Spanish or by any other type of colonizer. And besides that, the kind of terror inflicted on the victims and the bloodshed that was spilled on their ancestral land carved a deep injury on the collective body of the Wayuu. Basically, as well, the deep injury was also related because this was an attack that contravened their traditional law and dispute resolution mechanism by particularly killing women and children and disappearing the body of 2 of them, one of them a child. In Wayuu society, men lead and engage in combat while women are responsible for attending to the injured, picking up the dead and burying them. Women, therefore, have a special condition of immunity. I'm talking here in the context of war. I know that, as we look into more kind of another type of engagements and we look at issues of domestic violence, the picture is quite different. But I'm talking here in the context of war and violent resolution of conflicts. Women cannot be fired upon or touched or any kind of vengeance-related violence because of the responsibility for walking through the pathways to pick up the dead and as well the injured. But as well, women do have this special role as are the ones who communicate with the sacred world of the spirits and dreams. And presently, this is at least for the last 3 or 4 decades, because they also are the ones who act as the appointed leaders of the communities, and they kind of do have a mediating role with the outside world of the non-Wayuu people. So basically, for the community, the fact that this massacre took place in their territory and that they are displaced, they basically had been fighting for the last 8 years for 3 things mainly. Their return to their land, the truth about how the massacre was committed in the territory, and as well about the disappearance of the women and to find out where they are. And so basically, the paper does have a session in which I do elaborate around an approach of memory as practice. I'm not going to go in there because of time, but just basically to say that one of the things that I'm engaging with in this paper, it is a critique to a very dominant model of memory within transitional justice kind of thinking of memory either as a healing or as a redemptive capacity. You know, we remember in that way, we don't forget and does not repeat again. And rather to look at memory as a kind of practice, as what it is, what people enact and do through memory, and what kind of memory claims they bring to particular situations. Basically I get into this. So in February 2011, the Wayuu community of Vallaportete hosted the visit of 2 prosecutors responsible for investigating the crimes and atrocities committed by the paramilitary between the mid-1990s and mid-2000s. The attorneys were part of the transitional justice process created by Law 975 of 2005 that regulated the demobilization process of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. This basically was a network of right-wing paramilitary groups that operated in the most of the country. In the commission, there were representatives from the National Attorney's Office, the National Commission of Reparation and Reconciliation, the Organization of American States, the Historical Memory Commission, the police, the Technical Investigation Team, and the German Technical Operation. As the community remained displaced at the time of the visit, and this is up to today, a delegation of approximately 40 members of the community, led by the traditional authority, leaders, community members, and children, returned to Vallaportete from Maracaibo in neighbor Venezuela, where now they live, and Riohacha, the capital of Guajira. During the 3 days of the visit, the community provided food, water, and shelter, and we were here in what was basically the destroyed remains of their community to all the visitors that they provided. For the authority and leaders of the community, the presence of the attorneys and the commission in their land marked a critical event in their 7 years of struggle for justice and truth on the events surrounding the massacre. The first night of the arrival, we gathered under the enramada and the community addressed the visitors. Agustin Fince, their authority, the elders, and the 2 young women who were appointed as the representative leaders of the community spoke to welcome us to their land and to stress that we were in their ancestral and autonomous territory. Following, the 2 leaders spoke on behalf of the community to state their demands and the goals for the visit: to be recognized as the legitimate owners of the Vallaportete, to ensure the safety conditions for a return to their land, and what they call to a clean territory. And by clean, they mean that there's no presence of the paramilitary or that there were no people from other territories inhabiting the land. And as well to know the truth about the women who had disappeared. The visit was furthermore for the community, as Carmen, one of the leaders, repeatedly told me, it was a critical event that allowed us to speak with the truth. I'm quoting them. Because for them to speak with the truth is to speak about their legitimate claim that they are the truthful owners of their land. During that night and in the following days, they spoke of their return as a duty to see and to inhabit the land, and as well to testify to the violent events that they had witnessed and the historical truth of the resistance. So, and the next, in the following 2 days of the visit, the community took us to several of their cultural landmarks in their territory. The port of Vallaportete, a talc mine, they call it Jamuya, Salima, the Sacred Hill, the Rock Building, the Mucuras, these are earthen rock jars, the horse track, the 2 cemeteries where their ancestors and relatives are buried, to the abandoned and destroyed homes, and to the different community facilities. We also visited Lucas, an elder Wayuu man, an authority who had returned with his wives and children a few years before. As we stop in each place, elders and authorities shared stories of the place and combined them with the specific justice claims. Why, I ask in this presentation, the recognition of these cultural landmarks and the stories they told are critical to their vision of justice and as truth evidence. How were stories embedded and in place in a landscape of devastation? Why were these stories performed and these places re-inhabited in this particular juncture? So I start by looking first at some oral testimonies and in place, what I call in place proof narratives. On the morning of the second day, we went to the talc mine. These are the type of rocks that characterize this talc mine. An astonishing landscape where a multitude of small talc hills spread throughout the desert. I forgot to say, this is a semi-desertic region. Talc mining was an important activity for the Wayuu in this region during the colonial and republican periods and had continued to be practiced occasionally by some of the family members. After we got on top of one of the hills, several community members described the mining process, the uses of the talc rocks, and pointed to several landmarks in the landscape. After, the authority spoke and his niece translated to us. And I quote him, quote what she said. The abuelo says that you may ask why he knows so much about the territory. This is because he was born and grew up in the territory. He makes this observation that this land belongs to us because of our past and our ancestors, because of the antiquity of those who first arrived here. And he says something very important. Even if we ourselves were not the owners of these lands, since we have been slaughtered here, because we have been killed, they belong to us as a compensation. The authority used first metaphors of kinship and territoriality to speak about their connection to land. Following, he established the key elements explaining the right to a territorial compensation. Compensations are widely applied within the normative system of the Wayuu to solve disputes in waiting arrangements and within animal distribution. Compensations are complex systems that, according to Wayuu's anthropologist Wilder Guerra, represent public affirmations of the value of the individuals and the socio-political position of the familiar group. When the blood of the family member is spilled on a territory in the context of a violent dispute, the family of the victim can request compensation for the blood spill. But furthermore, if the blood of the family member is spilled in someone else's territory, they can set a claim on the territory. The elders and leaders' emphasis throughout the visit on their territorial ownership is explained by a series of events that have taken place after and before the massacre. And basically, in these events, different members or staff from the judicial offices have doubted their status as displaced people, as the legitimate owners of their land, or as well in terms of where they were the true victims of this massacre. So later, as we gather in the cemetery of the Uriana family, one of the elders recounted a story about Remedios, his aunt and oldest daughter in the family. His grandfather had taken Remedios to the cemetery and asked her to gather Ica. Ica is the ancestors and the ancestors' remains. Rosario had to perform the third and final reburial before the traces of a generation disappear. As the oldest daughter, she had to ensure the passage of these remains into a newly reconstituted generation by gathering together all the bones and remains. While performing this duty, she inhaled the fine dust produced by the movement of the bones and became very sick. This history described to those of us present their relatedness to their ancestors and reaffirmed the in-depth relationship between kinship, memories of the past, and place. it was also told as an evidence of their ownership of the land, as according to Wayuu normative systems, territoriality is demonstrated by the presence of cemeteries that hold the remains of the family ancestors. After this story, Vicente, one of the elders in the community, addressed the attorneys, and he said, "Now I say, to reinforce what my cousin had said already, the only document of indigenous people are these." And he was pointing to the cemetery and to the landmarks that they have shown. "This is most sacred to us. This has been done since long time ago." So there are two elements here that I would like to highlight here in relationship to this kind of in-place testimonial practice. First, it is the granting to the natural world of an archival capacity to store history and memory, and to become a receptacle of knowledge about what happened and why. Second, it is the embodied performance by which elders and leaders told their histories of each place in place and connected them to histories, to their connected these histories to their present and to their claims. This is what with Erin Baines we have called the living archive, and place practices and spaces where survivors and community members retain and transmit memory in everyday encounters. So I'm really going to, I'm aware of time. I think I have like 2 or 3 minutes left. I'm just going to move into a final kind of vignette to illustrate some of these testimonial practices. And this one took place in the very last gathering of this visit, when we got together for a final talk with the attorneys. And basically, during this final gathering, one of the young women basically introduced the gathering, as we say, we gather here today to demonstrate that here we have the truth above all. And she reflected how visitors who came to their land may have asked themselves why to go to so many faraway places and to visit all these different places. But she reminded us that each place holds a particular meaning. Following her, one of the attorneys addressed the community and basically spoke about how, for her, being in their territory had been to put faces, clear faces to the victims, and to what for her as an attorney and in a country that has over 300,000 victims, to have a face is to kind of humanize the conflict. And this was kind of the closing remark that she was doing. But at the moment that she was closing, one of the elders got up and basically addressed her and the other attorney and said, "It has been 7 years of meetings and dialogue. We want to know how long these meetings are going to last." We chose them, and he's talking about the leaders, the young leaders. But we ask ourselves, is it going to be a real reparation? It has been 7 years. I look distrustfully at the information they are giving me. I want to understand if it is justice and peace, this is the name of the transitional law, or if it's going to be like in Wayuu's justice, with a maximum of 5 years to do justice. And following him, several authorities reinforced this idea of that within the Wayuu system, it is within 5 years, and that basically the time was over. And they were reinforcing this idea, particularly because within their system, if within 5 years there's no justice, then there is room for a declaration of war. So it was a kind of a warning. But the kind of reflection that I know I have to finish here, that I think it is quite important to reflect here, it is that they brought it to interpolate a very different type of justice system. So the type of reflection and questions that I end up this presentation with, it is what happened when there is this type of encounters and disencounters, when narratives of justice are brought from different systems, and when in this case, indigenous people use their storytelling and their visit to the landmarks to enact what they saw as the powerful truth to be the legitimate owners of their land, but that somehow there is a disjuncture and this encounter between the two logics that were at place. For the attorneys, they wanted to walk out of here, having the community saying, we want to become part of the transitional justice systems, which they didn't get it. For the community, they wanted the attorneys to walk out of way to saying, they now own our truth. And I must say I doubted that they walk with that one. So basically, it is, I end up with this kind of open question about what kind of record took place here. Thank you. Oops.
Thank you very much, Pilar. Our third paper, just have to switch this. Our third paper is presented by Susan Erickson from Simon Fraser University, and her paper is entitled "The Work the Record Does."
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Zane. Thanks so much to Lisa and Andrea for inviting me to this fantastic conference. Very happy to be here. This paper is taken from the last chapter in a manuscript on the political economy of credibility in German obstetrics. Is it not on? Can you hear me? Yes. Yes. In the chapter itself, the mutapas that I'm going to be talking about today actually brings together the various elements of the political economy of credibility. So it's a bit of an exclamation point at the end of the book. But today I'm going to be talking about the mutapas itself. So the prenatal record in Germany, the mutapas, which translates to the motherhood passport, is a pregnancy documentation system about the size of a travel passport, small enough to fit into your coat pocket. Empty, the mutapas is a template for a responsible pregnancy, and filled, the mutapas is a legal document. During a 10-year anthropological project in Germany from 1998 to 2008, I paid attention to the mutapas empty, the mutapas filled, and the processes in between. The mutapas plays a primary role in establishing women's prenatal care expectations. Given to women immediately following a positive pregnancy test, it provides a step-by-step, week-by-week prenatal care plan. The mutapas is often experienced by women pregnant for the first time as a government and doctor-sanctioned instruction booklet for how to have a responsible pregnancy. Complying with the mutapas is generally recognized as equivalent to being a good mother, as one of my interviewees told me. A pregnant woman does not enter her own data into the mutapas, although she is very likely to carry it on her person. Most women took seriously the directive printed on the back cover. During the pregnancy, you should always have your mutapas with you and bring it to every doctor's examination, especially the delivery. Your mutapas belongs with those documents which you should always keep in a secure place. Now, caring compliance was nearly 100%. Most women I met seemed to have their mutapas with them at all times. I met only one woman in hospital who did not have her mutapas with her, and she was sent home to retrieve it before she would be seen by the obstetrician. Along with the Führerschein, which is driver's license, and the Reisepass, which is travel passport, the Mutapass is among the most widely recognized documents in contemporary Germany. And if you spot a Mutapass in a neighbor's handbag, for example, you can reasonably conclude that she is pregnant. Like a driver's license and passport, it signifies responsibilities and bestows privileges. When I attended the German opening in 2000 of Körperwelten, that exhibit of plastinated bodies, which came to Vancouver in 2010, pregnant women were invited to the head of the line. As proof of pregnancy, they showed their mutapass and went in. Normal wait times in line at that time were 3 to 7 hours. Not being pregnant and without a mutapass, I waited for 4 hours. So the work the record does. At its most basic, a mutapass is a 32-page health record that charts the pregnancy, birth, and postpartum care of 2 pregnancies, 16 pages per pregnancy. As a legal document, the mutapass is proof of the job the obstetrician did, providing prenatal care protocols mandated by the government. Some of the work the mutapass ends up doing then is the job of documenting care provided, risks assessed, diagnoses, and treatments. As the obstetricians see it, the work the mutapass does is that which accomplishes conventional public health indicators of maternal and infant health. The director of West Hospital, one of my research sites, told me directly that the Mutterpass and the German Birth Survey provide quality control in perinatology and are responsible for the declines in maternal and infant mortality since 1955. I found it was all that and more. The Mutterpass, in fact, makes risk. It is designed for this, in fact. In the prenatal exam room, it is a primary tool by which risk is assessed, and obstetricians characterize women into risk categories to triage care. In Germany, the detection of a single prenatal health indicator of the 52 indicators listed in the Mutterpass, these are the pages of risk that can be checked, that then moves the woman into the high-risk pregnancy category. And annually, 70 to 80% of all women giving birth in Germany are deemed categorically high risk. The Comoros have written about a habitual, non-agentive power hiding in mundane and quotidian use of things. Documents like the Mutterpass possesses a representational authority that is capable of dominating social thought and action in ways that go largely unquestioned. There is no section of the Mutterpass, for example, that attends to the organizing of the coming together of people, friends, family, and wise others, and practices including baths, massage, music, yoga, breathing, or any kind of exercise that would support pregnant women and is actually in keeping with a substantial body of evidence-based literature. Instead, only particular kinds of prenatal care risks and practices, mostly biotechnical, are encoded and therefore enforced in the Mutterpass. Of these practices, only a small number are evidence-based, an issue of major concern for women's reproductive health care advocates in Germany. And as such, obstetrical authority and dominion is made through the social habit, through the critical mass use of the Mutterpass. Hundreds of women across Germany every day embody the Mutterpass through quotidian acts of prenatal care. In the German case, because there is a fair level of transparency to the system, it is possible to see how documents are capable of drawing together disparate emotional, medical, political, economic, and epidemiological domains to produce everyday logics in prenatal care that women easily comply with. Not all documents or records everywhere are as capable of this kind of what Nicholas Rose calls contingent lash-up, but the Mutterpass is. Siemens, and then there's another layer here, Siemens, Toshiba, and GE have fought hard to market the particular kinds of things that make their machines necessary to the finding of these risks. That's a whole nother level of this. Most of my work in Germany focused on prenatal diagnostic imaging, and the Mutterpass is one of the mechanisms that makes the ultrasound scans part of every prenatal exam. Time today allows for only a relatively small and short example from my ethnographic work on imaging, but I aim to show how documents themselves are always in the making. When I was in Germany, Nackentransparenz, and so if you have seen ultrasound pictures before, you know that you can find the nose of the baby here, right? Okay, so that's the head. This would be the rest of the body laying in the uterus. And then this mark here are the calipers. Very sorry, it's messed up your system here too. Yes, I'm rather loud that way, aren't I? Okay, so there's measurements that are made between these calipers that are just digital points that then are computed through the machine itself, which is of course an ultrasound machine itself, which is of course a computer. But this space is actually fluid. This is Nackentransparenz, which in English translates to nuchal transparency, which refers to the measurement in an ultrasound image of the translucent space along the neck of a fetus 9 to 4 weeks gestational age. The translucency in the image is actually fluid under the skin. Now, studies in the early 1990s linked high nuchal translucency measures to probabilities of Turner syndrome and Down syndrome. The scan gives no concrete diagnoses, is based on algorithms derivative of and dependent on statistical calculations, but they trigger a new round of tests that almost always include something more conclusive like an anxieties. Enthusiasm for nuchal translucency scans waned quickly because there were so many false positives. By the mid-1990s and into the early aughts, all scans because obstetricians had successfully recommended it as a medically necessary scan to the bureaucratic agency able to mandate it. But most importantly, nuchal translucency scans became routine because it was listed in the Mutapass. So I've copied the Mutapass pages from several years to make a point. Highlighted in yellow is the German medical term for the nuchal scan, and over time, if you could see this a bit better, what you would see is that the item changes, starting off as a separate and mandatory category of assessment in 1996, and ultimately by 2012, disappearing altogether. I show this to document how record templates themselves change, and to point out that few of the nearly 200 women I interviewed over 10 years understood the basic evolution of medical knowledge. Knowledge changes, evolves, is debated, and is vulnerable to the interests of the powerful. Again, a point I take up in my book, but not this paper. And documents like the Mutapass, however, provide the appearance of a certainty, solidity, authority, and perpetuity that bodies do not have and in fact cannot possess. This disconnect between bodies and records, in this case, meant that 70 to 80% of pregnant women are pathologized when the rates of permanent debilitating genetic and physical anomalies in women and infants at birth is 3 to 5%. The difference between 70 to 80% and 3 to 5% is a lot of false positives, which in fact is what the obstetrical system in Germany has come to find quite acceptable. The many uses of the Mutapass. I'm moving to a different section here. The Mutapass is significant on several registers simultaneously, not least of which is as an iconic symbol of German motherhood. The Mutapass emerged as a social form that is simultaneously a German icon, medical fact, and for many a kind of love object. Women's affection for the Mutapass is often mixed with loving their children. Several families showed me their baby's first ultrasound pictures, the tip of the hat to Lisa Mitchell, in albums in which pages of the Mutapass had been copied and lovingly scrapbooked. Some of them had bought, as you see here, or hand-sewn cloth covers for the Mutapass booklet and brought the whole ensemble out to show me from handcrafted memory boxes that also often included their baby's plastic hospital bracelet and other birth keepsakes. In multiple social settings, many women, even those with grown children, when they learned of my research, described the Mutapass fondly or brought it out directly to show me. It is a thing in the most symbolically significant sense, and it was often touched, stroked, and usually held with great affection. When I began speaking publicly about the Mutapass, first in classrooms and later at conferences, I was struck by the number of German-born students and conference-goers who approached me to recount memories of their own, their mothers' and sisters' fond fixations with the Mutapass. I became further intrigued by the Mutapass as an artifact because of the emotions my scholarly critiques of this paper record provoked. I was caught unawares after a first conference presentation of my findings in the US when two German women in their late 20s approached me to defend the Mutapass, which they felt was besmirched by my presentation that suggested the Mutapass disciplined women in the Foucauldian sense. Yes, it was during those days. They ardently explained to me that the deeper significance of the Mutapass, which they pointed out I had missed, was that the women carry their own prenatal record. Women hold the document. Women are responsible for the document, for keeping it safe, and thus, they said, the Mutapass makes women take responsibility for their pregnancies. They saw women's holding of the Mutapass as a liberating transfer of medical authority. The German women make an important point. It's a point I can't help but trouble, though. I did not find that the Mutapass upended the conventional doctor-patient relationship. Power and authoritative knowledge resides squarely with the obstetrician, whose use of the Mutapass not only helps maintain, but simultaneously works to constitute relations of power and authority. Through the work the Mutapass pages do, this center of calculation, to borrow from Latour, encodes particular medical categories as fixed, uniform, and predictable, despite that women and fetuses' conditions are more often fluid, variable, and uncertain during the months of pregnancy. The form itself shapes expectations. The empty spaces set up a prospective trajectory of a good pregnancy. Only particular data make sense in the empty spaces. The spaces are tiny and require truncated, acontextualized information. While pregnancy can complete itself, the Mutapass cannot. It requires someone to enter data, and filling in the Mutapass requires high levels of coordinated, socialized action and behavior. Data is usually entered each visit by an obstetrician, nurse, or midwife. Compliance with the expectations of the empty form was remarkable. Most women wanted everything filled out in the Ngyiampaa. I saw women find blanks and bring the blanks to the doctor. They said, I need this filled and this one too. It was not just patients badgering about filling in the blanks. Among patients, nurses, and midwives and obstetricians, I also witnessed a preoccupation with filling in the blank spaces of the Ngyiampaa. And I regularly saw people, professionals and patients alike, chastising each other to fill in the blanks and fill them in completely and correctly. Everything must be totally correct in there, one midwife explained to me. So whose work is anticipated by the Ngyiampaa? The German conference goers were right. The Ngyiampaa is designed to be retained by women, but what does retention alone signify? Does retention of a driver's license mean the driver's own data that appears on it, or that the data is not used by the state, or that the data is always used to benefit the driver? Certainly not. To an outsider like me, the Ngyiampaa appeared, yes, physically possessed by women, but not controlled by them. Women did not appear to use the data to make decisions about their pregnancies, and never in the self-possessed way the obstetricians did. Women's autonomy in birth decision-making was not accomplished through the Ngyiampaa. In fact, once a data point was entered into the Ngyiampaa record, there was a general consensus that anything entered there fell under the decision-making dominion of the obstetrician for the duration of the pregnancy. A single data point entered into the Ngyiampaa could shape and stick to the pregnancy until well after birth, through to the end of a woman's reproductive years, in fact, even if the categorical risk event lasted only a single minute, an hour, an afternoon, and even if the woman herself disagreed with its significance, as women sometimes did. Rarely, but sometimes. While the Ngyiampaa does fulfill the goal of educating women about pregnancy, some German women's health care advocates argue that the Ngyiampaa normalizes high-tech medicalized birth and contributes to unwarranted categorizations of high-risk pregnancy and anxiety. Studies show that this does in fact increase anxiety for pregnant women, thereby necessitating the further medicalization of pregnancy and birth. Advocates agitate for less medicalized revisions to the checklists in the Ngyiampaa, thereby, they say, altering women's expectations about what constitutes appropriate prenatal care. There's recognition by feminist healthcare advocates that the Ngyiampaa is shaping expectations and thus necessitating high rates of intervention and high biotechnical approaches to birth in general. So in conclusion, as Latour reminds us, domination is not a given but a slow construction. And in Germany, relative to biomedical birthing practices, the Ngyiampaa helps pathologize a large majority of pregnant women in Germany. My research found that most German women are not troubled by this, and the Ngyiampaa is not recognized in Germany as a documented discipline. To the contrary, there is widespread compliance with and even love for the Ngyiampaa. The Ngyiampaa enlists pregnant women in the circulation and maintenance of very particular kinds of knowledge at the exclusion of other kinds of knowledge, and as such, the record in this case is both product and producer of obstetrical expertise. And we are again reminded, thank you so much, Lisa and Andrea, for this conference on the record. We are again reminded that records themselves are social forms worthy of our scholarly attention and research inquiries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susan. We have a discussant, first of all, to introduce. Oh. So it gives me a particular pleasure to introduce a very, very good friend of mine. This is the first time we've ever been in a panel together in I don't know how many years of friendship. I'll try not to cry. Our discussant today is Dr. Naomi Adelson from York University.
Thank you. Great. Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Lisa and Andrea, to first of all read and reflect on these particularly rich and evocative papers, and to offer some relatively brief comments to begin the conversation. As the organizers originally wrote, the session's intent is to highlight the anxieties, both productive and disruptive, of human bodies as objects of historical and emerging records for classification, monitoring, and regulation, and as subjects accommodating, resisting, and remaking the records of their existence and identity. Each of the papers presented today, drawn from ethnographic research in 3 distinctive regions of 3 separate continents, offers us exceptional opportunities to reflect on the ways in which human bodies are implicated in record-making practices and the ways in which record-making practices are implicated in the making and remaking of bodies. The oral testimonies of the Wayuu linking land, body, memory, and politics is an assertion of records and an insistence on the embodied practices of memory. The records of lives of pregnant women who traverse and disrupt the boundaries of body and record making by insisting that their own pregnancies are not complete, their bodies not fully recognized or realized without specific documentation. The bodies of the Murrin Bridge people objectified as clinical entities, viewed first through statistical norms and racializing discourses. Each instance demands that we explore with greater care the relationship between bodies, records, and identity. Each example offering a compelling way in which bodies extend into and through, sometimes producing, sometimes disrupting, the record-making process. From the first inking of our infant feet to the registering of our own deaths, we cannot escape the documentation, the recording, the overt or subtle monitoring, regulation, and self-regulation, that's another paper though, of our lives. In Rabineau and Rose's terms, these are the strategies for the governing of life, the enactments of biopolitics. Biopolitics, they say, entails one or more truth discourses about that which is determined to constitute the vital character of living human beings, an array of authorities considered competent to speak that truth, strategies for intervention upon collective existence in the name of life and health, and modes of subjectification in the name of individual or collective life or health. Practices of record-making, and in particular medical record-making, are, of course, enactments of biopolitics. Those acts, however, those discursive strategies of intervention are neither uniform nor equal in access, opportunity, or outcome. Collectively, the papers presented today reflect upon the degree to which those strategies are contingent, and importantly, how they are not simply in or of the body, but in the interpolation of bodies and records, and hence bodies as subjects and objects, as observable and recordable, as observing and recording. Any biopolitics, we learn from these papers, can neither begin nor end with the individual body. Rather, it is a process of active engagement, informing and informed by social and political processes. In Susan's work that she presented today, there's a distinctive and clear articulation of a truth discourse in which citizens and professionals alike are willingly implicated in the subjectification process. The official document, a passport assuring entry into and citizenship within the state of gestation, is created, interpreted, and valorized as embodied. One is incomplete as a pregnant woman without it, or rather, perhaps one is incomplete as a pregnant German woman without it. With apologies, Daniela, I'm sorry. Women are complicit in the integration of data and bodies, with the Ngyiampaa serving as the willing implement of subjectification. And in that process, as Susan argues, it is a tool for the hyper-medicalization of pregnant bodies, creating and then validating only very particular elements and experiences of being pregnant, signifying bodies as particular data, ultimately blurring this distinction between bodies and records. And in another example of her work on the implications of data creation and management in her global health business article, she compares the valuation of data in Germany and Sierra Leone. As a complement to this work on the Ngyiampaa, and as an important and critical reflection on the major theme of this panel, in that article, Susan systematically removes any remaining doubt that health data is ever, and I quote her here, freely formed, objectively originated, or accurate, end quote. Health data is contingent, and it is in those interstices of contingency that power is articulated. The Mutterpass, as a detailed chronological recording of a woman's vital signs, fills the spaces between subject and object, and quite literally, as you just pointed out. The Mutterpass is an exemplary of the interrelationship of bodies and records, each incomplete without the other, and together powerfully circumscribing the status and identity of willing citizens. For the people of Murren Bridge, by stark contrast, there are few opportunities to reconcile their own sense of identity with the medical records that are created of them, but which then serve to recreate them in the powerful image of those very records. The persistent objectification, distancing, and effective marginalization of Aboriginal peoples on their own lands through ostensible practices of medical care is, suggests Daniela, an act of epidemiological racialization and worse. The statistical records which serve as the lens through which the people of Murren Bridge are effectively recognized create a myopia, distorting the vision and perspective of medical practitioners to only that which they expect to see. From Daniela's ethnographically detailed expose, we learn of the imposition of meaning onto bodies through a lens of statistical valuations and the historical violence of racism and neglect. The records stand in for the people and stand in the way of alternative discourses. It is not Daniela's intent to create a simple dichotomy between what medical practitioners envision and what the Aboriginal people attempt to assert to counter that vision. It is similarly not my intent to present her argument as such here either. What is central to her work is the way in which individuals and communities challenge the imposition by expressing and reflecting upon their own sense of identity out of necessity and against a persistent intervention on collective existence in the name of health. An exhaustingly persistent power imbalance is nevertheless, and despite best efforts, articulated through records, statistics, and the bodies that come to be represented as those epidemiological valuations. Daniela presents a powerful study of the contingency of truth discourses and the ways in which, in the name of good health, individuals, independent of their own will or intent, are reduced to the vital epidemiological signs of biomedical valuation. And now shift to how bodies become the medium of communication, of meaning, and of power. Memory, as data, says Pilar, is inscribed in, on, and sometimes quite literally through the bodies of the people of Bahia Portete. Memory, she says, is a bridging practice which highlights the role of memory acts in triggering associations and relationships to the past. That memory is further inscribed on the bodies of the Wayuu people as a difficult yet compelling expression and affirmation of both violence and resistance. Memory as practice, explains Pilar, recognizes the active processes of reconciling the past, the verbal and non-verbal constructions, not reconstructions of history. These constructions, not uniformly agreed upon but understood as relative and necessary, create the basis for exchange, become the data sets and embodied practices of knowledge transmission and political process. These seemingly mundane, yet in fact hardly charged practices of setting embodied memories create the necessary space between subject and object, between persecution and resistance, and open up a critical venue for dialogue in an assertion of identity. In the three papers presented here today, the question of the construction of data in that assertion of particular identities, who is constructing it for what purpose, force us to consider and unsettle the relationship between bodies and records. That relationship is never simply a given, never as singular in representation nor interpretation, but fluid, meaningful, and powerful. These papers show us, too, that we cannot reduce our analyses to the ephemera, to representations without meaning or longer-lasting implications. Much as bodies matter, as we've been saying for well over a decade now, and as much as data has been critically analyzed, recognizing that we too as anthropologists are implicated in its construction and circulation, what equally matters and what must be pay attention to are the spaces, and I have a new term for that, the nuchal translucencies, between bodies and records. And I will use that with thanks. That's great. Taken together, the analyses presented today offer and reflect upon the various ways in which we traverse and analyze those spaces and the very real implications of the relationship between bodies and records in the lives of the people themselves. Further, they remind us yet again that the critical study of biomedicine and of bodies never begins nor ends with the analysis of practices alone. Experiences of health, wellness, or suffering are never outside context and always, as I've said, always contingent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been a great panel, and we do have time for questions. Yes?
A question for Professor Erickson. One of the things that your paper interested me in was the further use of this data. For example, used as evidence in child custody cases of women's failures as mothers. Were these data subpoenaed into court?
I have to say, I don't know. It's been used against obstetricians for relative to custody. I don't know, but I can't exclude it either.
Well, one other question I want to ask you. What about street entrenched women? I mean, so you're painting a picture of 100% participation by German women, but surely there are women living in the streets of Munich and Berlin who resist compliance because they have another view, perhaps. And is this a further form of alienating those women?
The short answer to that is yes.
Hang on, so if they do enter the system, is it yet another way in which they are further discriminated in the system because they haven't maintained these records?
Yes. So there is widespread compliance. You can't actually be in the system without it. So if you opt for non-hospital births, which 1% of the less than 1% of the population has a birth at home, they still sometimes will use it, but not. I mean, there's not really, the main point relative to the record in bodies is that because they don't have a record, because they aren't documented, they don't count. They don't matter. Their birth statistics don't get registered in any kind of socially meaningful way. They disappear. They get disappeared because they don't have the documentation.
And then back to the first question, I think, yes, this record is used against women in all kinds of places, not just child custody, major criminal cases of drug abuse and so forth.
So I know that it has been used very peripherally in what they call the right not to, there have been some right not to be born cases brought by children against their parents, right? And then there's some cases where parents have tried to sue obstetricians, but it gets into this into sociality in many different kinds of ways, but you've prompted me to, now I need to know this about custody, so thank you very much for the question. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Actually, the Wayuu's land extended from Colombia to Venezuela, so it is a matter of colonial boundary tracing of, nation making, that they were divided, in two countries. So but it has been as well very interesting because when the massacre took place, Chavez was in power. And they really contrast the kind of very cold reception and acknowledgement that they got in Colombia of their situation of displacement. That's why they insist that they are the owners of the land. And a very welcoming reception in Venezuela. But in that case, because they are binational, they have both nationalities, they weren't recognized as refugees. So it complicated completely the humanitarian intervention system. And now at this moment, they do have all the time to negotiate actually that type of binational border crossing in a way of, if you want, in a system of taking advantages, disadvantages, possibilities and contrasts. But even, for example, for their return, they have to be registered. And to be registered, the Colombian institutions cannot go to Venezuela to register them because it will become a diplomatic mission. So it is a complicated system, but basically, I think the Wayuu quite strategically use it as well in terms of political demands. And really to, for example, now in terms of what they are demanding in terms of the type of dwelling they should have built, because Chavez has provided some of them with houses, and the houses that Chavez provides are really very good in comparison to the ones that the Colombian government do. They do have as well more, if you want, political capital to say these are the type of dwellings that we demand. So it's a very rich, dynamic in that way, and a lot of implications now as well in terms of children who grew up in Venezuela in a capital, in a large city, and now will go back to the desert to live as well, the intergenerational dynamics.
One more question, Pilar?
Yeah.
Where walking is about being social, it's about knowing the country. You walk to know country, you walk to be with people. And I'm wondering whether Ngyiampaa people are they using the word mobility? Are they using the word?
They're using the word mobility, yes.
Do they read it in that kind of the way my GP reads it?
Yes.
Or are they using it in that old Aboriginal sense of knowing and being with?
Knowing and being, precisely, yeah, that's how they use it. And I mean, it's actually not something that's used at all by the medical healthcare providers in that particular setting. So it's, I didn't kind of explore that further because of those reasons, but I mean, what really the point is in that regard is not simply to actually explore the kind of multiple bodies in those terms, but also to look at kind of go beyond what people who, for instance, have talked about engagement in sociality previously, like Marilyn Strathern in The Gender of the Gift in the late 1980s, and kind of, going beyond this idea of we actually looking and working with individuals rather than individuals. But it's kind of actually moving on to the more recent literature in that regard, which is sort of what the point I was trying to make, which is basically saying that, we can't simply look at social practice and kind of mobility in a kind of visual present sense, if you like being socially present. But we also need to actually take into consideration the way in which people perceive things, which means, as an anthropologist, you actually have those discussions after those encounters between the healthcare providers and the patient have taken place, which is, of course, a realm the medical people are actually not participating in, which is kind of part of that problem, So kind of perception, perspectives, what does that actually mean in detail, and how is kind of being as well as, being as well as kind of bodily mobility in a kind of individualized versus a socialized versus kind of ontological domains is actually all of those overlaps in a sense, right? So how can we actually theorize that in more recent, in the future? I mean, that was basically what I'm trying to get at. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists. That was a great session. And